I'm Siddharth Zarabi, and with me my colleague Abha Bakaya as we count down to the Modi government's 10th budget and Nirmala Sitharaman's fourth presentation, fourth outing in Parliament. A big budget really that is expected, coming bang in the middle of Modi 2.0 and our booster shot budget, as we have been calling it on India Today. This budget, which is being presented today by Nirmala Sitharaman, is going to be seminal and very, very important. Like I told you, the 10th budget of this government, the fourth outing by the finance minister, and very clearly it comes at a time when India has hopefully successfully battled the third year of the COVID-19 pandemic. It comes a few weeks before assembly elections in key states of India. Remember, there are 7 elections this year and 5 of them in March. So can this budget revive India's economy? Can it give a boost to consumption and investment and put the country on an equitable growth path? Will this budget create jobs, boost that aspect, as well as enhance social welfare? How will Nirmala Sitharaman walk between that tough path of fiscal consolidation on one side and continuing support to growth? After all, the past year, which is the current financial year, has been a year of ups and downs. So for all of that, keep tuned in as we unpack yet another budget by the Modi government and tell you through the day today what is in it for you. And I'm going to get you some more details of the budget, Abha. Very clearly a very important day for all of us here. And if you can see, let's start with some of the important data points as we bring up, which is one of the key ones being the GDP estimate. But before that, the 10th budget of the government, and this is a history of the Modi budgets. July 10, and if you look down, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and the late Arun Jaitley, one of the finest lawyers of the country, a BJP stalwart. Piyush Goyal did one interim budget on the 1st of February. That was 2019, the year of the general election. And Nirmala Sitharaman's been here before 3 times, the 5th of July and in 2020 and 2021. And 2021 as a budget was a very significant and important budget. And now the main headline which the economic survey brought to us. Let's start with that number, the GDP estimate, and right here, the economic survey number of 8 to 8.5%, and you can compare it with other estimates, the IMF at 9%, the World Bank at 8.7, 7.8% by the RBI, the India ratings, and this is the next financial year's estimate. Let's just focus for a moment on the economic survey estimate, and very clearly the economic survey estimate tells us that as far as the GDP is concerned, from the current year's run rate of 9.2%, remember that final number is not still with us, it is going to come in perhaps in this range. It could be better. There's been a bit of a concern around the third wave of Omicron, but we are going to talk about that with all our guests today. And Abha, take it from here, because the markets are expecting another big bang budget, and for the Aam Aadmi there has to be something which takes care of all the pain that he has seen because of the third wave of Omicron and even before that. Abha.
All right, let's take a look at the economic survey and take a look at some of the key highlights from that as well. It will pull up some of those points as well, and a lot of indicators coming in from that tabling of the economic survey yesterday. The government sees FY23 GDP at 8 to 8.5%. Now, while by some this is being seen as slightly guarded, on the other hand, the government feels the engine is running on track. India to remain the fastest growing major economy in the world during 21 to 24. They're talking about how all the parameters are recovering post-COVID and now starting to chug forward at a good pace. FY22 GDP growth seen at 9.2%. Those are some of the key growth numbers coming out of the economic survey table yesterday. Agriculture to grow by 3.9% in FY22. Now remember, this is something that they also talked about, how the pain on the agri sector wasn't as bad as anticipated. Industrial sector growth growth, they see it at 11.8% in FY22. So that's the number coming in on that front. And services sector growth is forecast at 8.2% in FY22. This is important because remember, this is where the brunt of the pain was felt and they are expecting it to bounce back. Investment is expected to see a growth of about 15% in 21-22. Government again, of course, talking a lot about very confidently about the kind of flows, the kind of wealth generation that we've seen this year so far, and really what to anticipate going forward as well. But Siddharth, this was also criticism coming in, that perhaps the government's talking a lot about one part of the economy that's done very well, but it's clearly not a broad-based recovery. And the question today will be, of course, how will they address that?
And well, like someone said, all manner of English alphabets, including the K-shaped recovery being spoken about. Abha, but let's get you some more details, viewers. And this time, let's focus on the fiscal deficit estimates, because that leads us to the big numbers as far as the consolidation exercise is concerned. And before we talk about this, let's try and bring up those numbers once again that we have there on the fiscal deficit estimate, the 6.8% number, as well as what is likely to be now spoken about. Now take a look at the trajectory of the fiscal deficit. Why is this important? Because this impacts the common man. This impacts the rate at which you borrow, and it's not just some economic number, it is actually one of the most important things. In financial year 20, 4.6%, which went up, as you can see, to 9.3%, and the budget estimate for the current year was 6.8%. And one of the key things, that the number that we'll be all looking out for very, very closely is 6.8% going to be bettered, which means could it be 6.5%? Why is that? Because tax revenue growth for the government in the current financial year has been phenomenal, almost up 70%, and we had GST numbers coming in just hours ago, which again prove the fact that there is a tax recovery. So let's move to the key challenges and priorities. The first one is the fiscal challenge. In the current financial year, the government has spent more on COVID support, food and fertilizers. If we take food and fertilizers together, almost an additional 1.5 lakh expenditure in an overall excess expenditure of 3 lakh crore. I must point out here that these numbers could change because we will see the final numbers. These are estimates. The disinvestment target of 1.75 lakh crore, again, big target, a very big sale, which is Air India, but in terms of cash, that has just got the government around 2,700 crore. Neelachal Ispat, pretty much ours back, one of the deals. LIC, and if you're thinking about the LIC deal, well, I can tell you the process is on. The LIC chairman has got another extension. There are a full 2 months left before the 31st of March. But before 31st of March, you have to get in all that money. Will the LIC IPO money come in during the financial year or next year? We don't know. So what do we expect? Support for growth. Remember, fiscal consolidation along with support for growth. Will it continue to support the growth and revival? And there are not just reasons of the political economy, but practical aspects to keep in mind. As far as taxation is concerned, this is again a significant point. Do not expect too many changes as far as taxes are concerned. Corporate taxes were changed significantly in 2019. Now the capex theory, the entire focus of the budget, the previous budget and even before that, has been capital expenditure on infrastructure. Is that going to go up? Perhaps around 25%. Farm sector, we saw the rollback, but there has to be something. Housing sector SOPs, the affordable housing story isn't doing that well. And then the PLI for manufacturing, including the most recent one, which was semiconductors. So as far as, and this is pretty much one of the recap points, and we'll stay with this for a few seconds, growth may slow down in the second half of the next financial year. There is clearly some emphasis on weaker consumption and high inflation. Inflation has been going up. There's a cost push pretty much all around. So there are some risk factors. That is why even the economic survey has spoken about 8 to 8.5%. And finally, if you just recap the challenges, there is some uncertainty, and that is why the tap may not be turned off. It may not be squeezed tight. Some of the accommodative fiscal policy, along with the RBI's accommodative monetary policy, is likely to continue. And that is one of the biggest points. Can some of the extra spending on food, for example, or the COVID-related expenditures, will that be rolled back? Higher funds expected for the Rural Employment Guarantee Program. Subsidies on food and fertilizers are going to go up. Like I told you, it went up significantly, including fertilizer subsidies pretty much doubling in the current financial year. So that's the expenditure outlook. And finally, as we talk about this, tax revenues, we saw this year being a stupendous jump, well over 25.6%, but it is likely that that kind of bumper growth in tax revenues may not happen. So we are basically looking at slower nominal GDP growth, lower excise on fuel. Remember, in November, the taxes on fuel were cut, petrol and diesel excise was cut, and there is an election round the corner. Oil companies have not been raising prices for quite some time. So that's the overall picture. But Abha, again, back with you for more details, and we are also going to get several guests lined up on the show today.
Absolutely. In fact, let me get in some voices, with yet another wave of the COVID pandemic, as well as upcoming elections. There are a lot of factors at play as well, and we've got some key voices that have been outlining some of the factors at play that the government may have to consider this time around. A power-packed panel for you. Dr. Montek Ahluwalia, ex-Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of India. We've got D. Subbarao, our former RBI Governor. Arvind Panagriya, ex-VC Niti Ayog, Professor, Columbia University. Kaushik Basu, economist, Professor of Economics, Cornell University. Dr. Arvind Virmani, former CEA Chairman, the Policy Foundation. Dr. Sajid Chinoy, Chief India Economist, JP Morgan Chase. Jayant Sinha, former MOS Finance, and Rhythm Desai, MD Morgan Stanley. A packed panel this morning to take us through some of their views on really what the budget will bring this time around. Now, it will be revealing, of course, the capex, the fiscal deficit targets for 22-23 just in a few hours from now. So the big question, of course, will be on spending. Will the Finance Minister loosen purse strings, or will they choose to take a more cautious path? Listen in to what the top economist suggests.
Given that we were hit by a recovery, in the short run, a worsening of the fiscal deficit compared to what was expected not be a problem. We had apparently projected a fiscal deficit of about 6.8% of GDP. That was based on, I think, an outcome projection of growth which is probably not going to be realized. So, in the remaining months of the year, I personally think that rather than being too hung up on hitting that 6.8% target, we can actually afford to do a certain amount of expenditure, which actually would help the economy.
The important point is this, that the target she has set for herself is 4.5% by 25-26, which is 4 years from now. So whether you're going to take some relaxation up front and consolidate very rapidly in the later years, or even it out over a 4-year period, is a big decision to take. And my own choice would be towards spreading it out evenly over the 4 years. That's why I said earlier that she must, opt for about between 6.5 to 6% this year, closer to 6%, and in fact go beyond that to give a path to consolidation over the next 4 years to reach 4.5% by 25-26.
All right, let's take a look now at how the markets have traditionally behaved on budget day. And this is actually going to be a fascinating one because remember, this year we're coming out of record highs, a great start to the year, and then a complete slide that we saw across global indices. Now, traditionally, and if you take a look at some of the key parameters here, we've got starting from 2018, you've got, the markets that were just a touch lower. 2019 up about 0.5% by the end of the day. July 2019, we saw markets again see a bit of a slide coming in, down about 1% or so. 2020 was pretty bad, down about 3.5%. So 2020 we saw the worst day, February 2020. That was also around the time that the COVID impact was hitting, and then of course we know the trajectory of the markets and how they bounced back. And in subsequent waves, we've only in fact seen the markets continue to go from strength to strength. So, you know, this time around, of course, we're coming on the back of a very, very strong move, but then a plummet on the back of global fears. This is again, you know, how we've seen across the Sensex, across certain budgets as well. And again, you see that dip in 2020, but in 2021, if we take a look, 5.3%. That's the kind of gain that we saw. That was clearly one that the markets enjoyed listening to. It was one, Siddharth, that you know, was reassuring on all fronts.
Yes.
The government, there was no negative surprise. It was reassuring, and I think clearly, even this time, markets just want to know that the worst of the pandemic is behind us.
Absolutely, and perhaps no shocks when it comes to taxing market gains. But some more voices. Let's hear out Sajid Chinoy, the Chief India Economist at JP Morgan Chase.
You know, the encouraging news is the level of activity is now back at the pre-pandemic level. So we're close to, a little ahead of where we were back in March of 2020. But really the next aspiration has to be, how do we go back to the pre-pandemic path? Where would India have been absent a pandemic? How far are we from that? And how quickly can we get back to that path? And I think this is where a fiscal policy has a role to play. And I would expect that the budget would provide support to close that gap with the pre-pandemic path. Now, a year ago, Siddharth, the intellectual consensus was clear. All countries were just emerging from the pandemic, so there was an open license for fiscal policy to be very expansive. And we saw that in last year's budget with a big push on capital expenditure. There's also a budget which was very well received because of much greater realism on tax revenues and much more transparency. This year, it'll be a slightly more delicate balancing act, because on the one hand, I would hope to see more capital expenditure, more infrastructure spending, more health and education spending to help the economy. But the global backdrop has become less benign. Oil prices are close to $90 a barrel. And because of the Fed, global financial conditions have tightened. So the balancing act this year will be, how do you provide near-term support to help the recovery and help jobs in particular? At the same time, reaffirm a credible medium-term consolidation path to preserve macroeconomic stability.
Dr. Virmani, coming to you now, and this is the big question. Should Nirmala Sitharaman now embark on significant consolidation, cut the fiscal deficit this year, or keep the consolidation for later?
So that's a very good question. I would look at it two ways. One, as the economic survey last year very clearly showed, that the best way to reduce the debt GDP ratio, which has definitely ballooned in the pandemic, mainly because of the collapse of tax revenue in the pandemic year. As you pointed out earlier just now, the revenues have of course recovered in the current, after the pandemic year. But in the pandemic year, the debt ratio went up a lot. And as the economic survey showed, and as our study of globally shows, that the best way to reduce the debt GDP ratio is to accelerate the rate of growth. So from that perspective, I think it's very important that the quality of expenditures be focused on, which is focus on those expenditures even for the next year. I think it was very important in the current year, but I think it's going to remain important for the forthcoming year, to focus on those with high labor intensity and high multipliers. Okay, all this stuff has been talked about before, but I think it's important to repeat it. So really the quality of the expenditures in terms of its multiplier effect and how quickly it generates employment, at least in the next 6 months, I think is what to be focused on. And thirdly, the growth rate. As I said, the growth is what will bring the actual GDP, debt GDP ratio down. I think the absolute size of the fiscal deficit is less important, but despite that, I think broadly the restraint on the fisc will remain. I don't think there'll be a big expansion. I don't think there'll be a contraction. It will be kind of go on as far as the intentions of the government is concerned, more or less at the steady level.
Mr. Narendran, let me bring you in here. Do you think as part of its response to the economic impact of the pandemic, the government will or should consider direct income support as well this time around, particularly for the underprivileged?
So we had, Siddharth, we had a few suggestions to the government. One is, of course, to continue with the support through Manrega, because that has been substantial and that has been important. So one is to continue with that as much as is required to make sure that the recovery is complete, particularly in the rural sector. The second part is to say, how is it that we can spend more on creating health infrastructure? Because if you really look at household incomes at the middle class and the lower middle class and the poorer people, they've been hit by the fact that their health expenditure has been far more than they'd budgeted 2 years back or 3 years back. So there is a concern that household budgets are under stress, household balance sheets are under stress because incomes have been hit. If the family is working in some of the sectors that have been more impacted by COVID, jobs have been hit and expenses have gone up in some of these areas. So there is a concern. Those are the households that need support. At the lower levels, you have Manrega. At a more higher level, it's more about how can you secure them against such kind of unplanned for expenses in the future by great expenditure in health infrastructure, and also to create something like a pandemic pool, a pool of capital that is available to respond to any future pandemic, and that can be created over a period of time. And CIS also submitted a paper to the government on that. So I think these are all areas to be done. And the more we can do about creating jobs and stability of incomes, the better chances that we will have of consumption coming back with the momentum that it had in the past.
All right, gentlemen, do stay with us. We have some of the biggest voices dissecting the expectations from budget this time, counting down now, just a couple of hours away. We're going to take a very quick break. You're with us here on India Today. Back in a moment.